Everyone, welcome back to Global Politics. Today, so last class we talked about Marxism, the context of Marxism, and the theory. So today what I want to look at is the idea of dependency theory. And in that context, I want to talk about the concept of imperialism, and then talk about dependency and world systems theories. And these are very similar theories that emerged in the 1970s, 1980s that brought a Marxist framework into understanding underdevelopment. All right, so last lecture we talked about Marxism, and we could call that kind of the orthodox position of Marxism. And what I want to suggest today is that there's a kind of adaptation to that position of Marxism, which we might call Lenin's theory of imperialism. All right, so let me start with a question. And this is, it's a straightforward question. It's not meant to stump you. What countries do you think of when you think of communism? Okay. And, if this were not an online course, then we could have a discussion about this. But just think to yourself, what countries do you think of when you think of communism? Right? And I've got some flags here you'll probably recognize in the kind of current present day. Have, of course, the People's Republic of China, China here on the top left. This flag here is the flag for Vietnam. This flag here you might recognize as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea. I don't know if you recognize this flag. This is the Cuban flag. This is the Laotian flag. And I just threw this in here to confuse people. This is the flag of the great state of Texas. All right, so when we think about current communist states, right, we generally think about communist China, right, communist Vietnam, Laos, some of these places that we lost during the Vietnam War, and of course Cuba. What about some of the places that have previously been communist? Well, of course, formerly parts of the Soviet Union, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan. All of these were former communist states. There have been other experiences of communism. Afghanistan at one point had a communist government. Cambodia, of course, was ruled by the Khmer Rouge. Mongolia has an experience with communism. And Yemen, it turns out, as well. A lot of the Eastern Bloc countries of the Soviet Union, so not part of the Soviet Union, but influenced by the USSR, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, all of these places were communist run as well. And of course, the Balkans, what was Croatia at the time, and Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. And finally, there have been leftist or communist governments in Angola, in Africa as well. Angola, Benin, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Mozambique. We did include Latin American countries here, but of course, I believe we talked about how Allende's government at one point was also communist, or at least leftist. Okay, so if we map out current and past socialist communist states, then, it's a lot of places, several places in Latin America, including present-day Cuba, Eastern Europe, Russia, China, and several spots in Africa as well, okay? So, what's wrong with this picture? What is wrong with this picture? That if we take our understanding of Marx, why does this picture not make any sense from a orthodox Marxist perspective? Okay, again, this is one of these points where if this were not an online class, I'd be pointing people out and asking for ideas and questions, but just on your own. You can pause this lecture, whatever. Now, think about this question. What's wrong with this picture? Well, what's wrong with this picture, of course, is that Marx expected that communism would arise in the most industrialized part of the world, right? He and Engels were in England during the height of the Industrial Revolution, right? The mechanization, the urbanization, the rise of factories, the rise of workers, all these kinds of things. The revolution was supposed to take place in the core, in the metropole, in the very place where industrialism was happening. That would be where the workers would unite and overthrow the bourgeois. And so it's strange, I think, from an orthodox Marxist perspective, that communism, to the extent that it succeeded as a political institution, succeeded in places where there was actually very little industrialization. Okay, so let's talk Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, born 1870, dies 1925, and he leads the Bolshevik Revolution. He leads the revolution in the early 1900s in Russia, where essentially, the workers do overthrow the kind of old, established order in the in Russia, and he becomes the first head of the Soviet Republic. And he pens this very famous piece on imperialism, and one of the things he asks in this context is, what is to be done? What is the role of Russia in the world sort of communist order? And one of the things that he points out is that communism and communist movements in the urban areas and the centralized areas have been unsuccessful, right? And they've been unsuccessful for a number of reasons. He argues that they've sold out to labor unions. They've become much more moderated. They've negotiated working hours and wages instead of actually going for the whole shebang. They're busy, right? I mean, if you're a worker, you're working, whatever, 8 to 5, 7 to 6. You're working 12, 18 hours a day. And so one of the things that Lenin proposed was this idea of a vanguard party. This is not something that comes up in the context of Marx. He says there needs to be a professional, educated party in order to organize the revolution. And this is what he calls the party that's at the vanguard party, and they operate according to the principle of democratic centralism. That is to say, they discuss things within the party, and once they make a decision, then they centralize and they all back that decision 100%, no dissent. Okay, so that's one of the innovations that Lenin makes. What's going on here? The other thing that Lenin says is, we go rebellion, we go revolution, or we go bust. We go all out. We don't compromise the way the unions have compromised. And then after the revolution, there is going to be a dictatorship of the proletariat. And in the Soviet context, there would be small local councils called Soviets that would allow for these direct democracy institutions to take place. So, the Soviet Union wasn't organized on the principle of authoritarian one-party state. There would be one party, but the small councils were meant to actually have input and feedback from the workers at the basic level. Okay, so two things. Rebellion or bust. There was no compromise, and of course you needed a party that was going to be at the vanguard. All right, so where does that leave things? Okay, so the question then is, why would Russia be at the forefront of the communist revolution, right? Because the idea was Russia was going to be the first one, and then it would spread to other places. And Lenin's argument was basically that there had been a global spread of capitalism, and that this global spread, the fact that capitalism now had its tentacles in the kind of developing world, basically meant that advanced countries could extract labor and resources from developing countries. And therefore, this actually prevented the revolution from occurring in the West, in the industrialized places, because they could move the labor exploitation. They could move the natural resource exploitation to the regions, to the non-European context. And so the logic here then is that Russia has to be where the revolution is going to be, because Russia is what's actually allowing for the continuation and the expansion of the global capitalist system, right? So Lenin is actually saying capitalism is now a global system. So whatever happened to this idea of dialectical materialism, this idea that really you needed to go through these processes of history, through feudalism, right? Through the rise of towns and the rise of a bourgeoisie and then the rise of the proletariat. Well, and so socialism was supposed to come after capitalism had essentially buried itself, right? Khrushchev had these famous words to America, we're going to bury you. The idea there was basically that capitalism would basically die its own death and that Russia would then just basically bury the carcass. And Lenin's argument basically said that socialism can actually leapfrog capitalism, that it can preempt capitalism and leapfrog directly into socialism. So revolution could spread to the core, but it wouldn't be immediate. It would first happen in the periphery. All right, so that's the context of Lenin adapting Marxist theory to accommodate the global spread of capitalism and the idea that communism could and should really be successful in the periphery before it happens in the so-called core. And now I want to then delve into two different, more contemporary arguments that look at global underdevelopment from this kind of Marxist or Leninist perspective. I don't know what's going on here. Whatever. Okay. So the first is something that we call dependency theory. Okay. And dependency theory is something that's developed again in the 70s. A lot of nationalist leaders basically accept the idea of free market principles even late into the kind of 19th century, 1800s, 1900s. And this is true kind of all over the world. There's a real embrace of sort of these notions that we even see today of free trade, of unbridled capitalism and so on. And only in the 1920s, the notion of protectionism, of economic regulation, and these kinds of things emerge. And this would become quite strong after the Great Depression, right, in the States, in Europe, and elsewhere. And in Latin America, there's this notion of import substitution industrialization, ISI, which is essentially this idea that you can build up your economy by producing things on your own instead of importing them from abroad. And in this context, there was an organization called the Economic Commission on Latin America, ECLA, which is actually a subsidiary of the United Nations. And a lot of intellectual power went into ECLA, and they really criticized development practices that had been occurring in Latin America, which were largely kind of industrialist, agriculturalist, export-oriented kinds of ways of development. And those scholars really argued that capitalism is sort of breaking into the developing world, and that then the solution to underdevelopment then is social revolution. Okay. So we have a guy named Gunter Frank, and Frank's argument essentially is that there is interdependence, that there's a strong relationship between the developed world and the underdeveloped world, that they are different sides of the same coin. And he dubs his theory dependency theory, right? So it's not as if his argument is that there's a kind of an advanced industrial world, and then there's kind of the poor world that hasn't caught up yet. His argument is that these two are dependent on each other. The reason why there's an advanced industrial world is because there's an underdeveloped world, right? And vice versa. And what he says is that there is essentially a core and a periphery, that that there is a metropole and that there's a state. And there are these satellites, and therefore we shouldn't think of the developed world and the developing world as two kinds of things, right? This idea of dualism, we need to think about it as a single system that relies on each other. It says that there's a metropolis where you have something like the United States, and then you have developing countries like Brazil, right? So that's a metropolis and a periphery or a satellite. And then each metropolis monopolizes its satellite and it extracts surplus value. So if you remember the Marxist arguments about extracting labor surplus value, it's the same concept there, except it's based on countries that were extracting the labor and the raw materials and the food and the natural resources and all those kinds of things from these places, and that they're feeding into the core. And if you recall, we talked about Brazil. He uses Brazil as a case study. He says in the early colonial period, sugar is grown and the profits are sent back to Portugal. This leads to underdevelopment and inequality. He argues that post-independence, after 1822, there's a period of free liberal trade, but again, there's a kind of global monopoly on raw materials and goods, and so it doesn't really fundamentally change the economic relationship between the West and the developing countries and the colonial, former colonial countries. So the 1930s brings a big crash of commodity prices on the world markets, and new political leaders promise more nationalist policies like ISI, import substitution, but he argues that these aren't really genuine alternatives either, and that they maintain a chain of dependence on the North because ultimately you're still producing the same kinds of things. You're just trying to produce them on your own. Okay, so, Gundor Frank is really the first one to kind of espouse this kind of perspective, highly critical perspective. But a lot of people also said, even though he's critical of dualism, the idea of developed and underdeveloped, he's also got a very dualist kind of framework. And people also critiqued him for saying that he lacks because he lacks a political aspect that recognizes different levels of underdevelopment. So not all places are necessarily going to be exactly the same. And in fact, some countries have actually climbed out of underdevelopment. Korea and some of the East Asian states, Japan, Taiwan, even some of the states in Southeast Asia being good examples. And so, I think his approach was highly valued, but also fell under some critiques. And so the other approach that in some ways is very similar but has some key distinguishing features is called world systems theory. And world systems theory was developed by a guy named Immanuel Wallerstein. And he made the same kind of observation that Gundor Frank did, that there's only one system in the world, and that world system is a global system of capitalism, and that essentially what we have is a global division of labor in the world. And again, this system he saw as being called world systems theory. And he argues that there are, and his books are like, hundreds of pages, multiple volumes, and over a large arc of history. But he argues that industrialization begins in England, France, and Holland, that these core economies develop strong states, and that they are the biggest beneficiaries of the capitalist world economy. And that in that context, they go out into the peripheral zones, they export, they import raw materials from those peripheral zones to the core. They also engage in coercive labor practices, and these places have relatively weak governments. And the examples that he uses are Latin America and in Eastern Europe. He also argues that you have the development of a small aristocracy within the peripheral region. So he recognizes that you're going to have landed elites and possibly industrial elites in a lot of these places that are actually going to be very sympathetic to the colonial powers' interests. Now, an interesting innovation for Wallerstein is that he argues that you have a core and you have a periphery, but you also have this buffer zone in between called a semi-periphery. And here he describes it as a place that has limited but declining access to international banking and high-quality manufactured goods. And these are places historically like Portugal, Spain, Italy, southern Germany, places that weren't a part of the Industrial Revolution per se, but also weren't, poor, underdeveloped countries either. But the semi-periphery actually is an important part of his argument, because what he argues is that countries can move between the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. So there's movement that's taking place across this spectrum. And so because you have this movement, because you have this idea that, that the poor countries have this idea that they can move into the semi-periphery and maybe eventually even into the core, there's no unified opposition against the core. And that's why the world systems, in his view, is so stable. And so you can see how this takes the dualist system that Günter Frank proposes and adds a little bit more sophistication and complexity to it. Okay, so it's just something I snagged off online, but the argument is basically that that there's a core, right? And the core exports goods to the periphery will export materials to the core, and each of them will also interact with the semi-periphery as well. And Wallerstein then begins around the 1400s, and he says that you saw the gradual rise and strengthening of states, especially these core states, through the process of bureaucratization, homogenization, coercion, and diversification. That you had low wages in the 1500s and 1600s, which leads to capital accumulation. That is, the ability for industrialists and capitalists to accumulate money and invest that into the industrialization process, and then engage also in long-distance trade in the Americas and in Asia. And he argues that this system leads to more and more capital accumulation and eventually a kind of development of an industrial process. He says that historically in the 18th century and onward, we shift to more industrial kinds of production, and more regions are then brought into the periphery, such as Asia and Africa. And these core regions encourage industrialization in the periphery, also long term, so that they can act as markets. In other words, once the materials are eventually extracted from these areas, it's okay too that these areas also start to develop economically, because we need someone to sell our goods to. Okay, and so the argument is that the blue countries here are the core, the purple countries are increasingly the semi-periphery, and the peripheral places are in pink. And this is essentially the way in which the world system operates, and that you do see some changes and shifts, but effectively you don't see a change in the system itself. Okay, so one last point I want to make is that there's a lot of conventional approaches, and we didn't talk about this in this class, but there's modernization theory, for example, which sees underdevelopment and inequality in this world as largely an internal problem. That is to say, if a country is poor, then it's that country's problem, right? And if there's going to be a solution, then that solution is basically external help, right? Either through materialist assistance, basically through aid, or through the building of capacity, right? Building of markets, learning new modern ways of behaving, and so on. So that's, I think that's a discourse, a way of thinking that still exists today in terms of underdevelopment. These are poor countries. They're not modern. They're not Western. If only they could do a little better, and maybe we can help them with outside assistance. Dependency theory and world systems theory inverts that argument. What it sees is underdevelopment as external. It's because of outside forces that countries themselves are poor, and progress then is not something that's really necessary from the outside, but progress is something that has to be mobilized internally. Okay? All right, so that is the lecture today on world systems theory and dependency theory, and kind of moving on to more conventional ways in which Marxist theory has been used in order to understand political economy. Okay, that's all we have for this time. Thanks for listening, and please leave your comments in the section below.